I accepted the Lord at a Methodist church. My family belonged to a independent Baptist church, and I heard the gospel all my life. But when I was in the 5th grade, a friend of mine in school said, "Oh, your church is so dull. Why don't you come over to our church? And we have a lot of fun." And so I asked my mother if I could go over to this Methodist church. And she said, on Sunday morning for Sunday school. And she said, "What time is the Sunday school?" Well, it happens that it worked out for me to go to their church and my church. And I only went there for maybe 2 or 3 months when they announced that there was going to be a revival. And the preacher was going to be a woman. Well, we'd never heard a woman preach, you know. And so I never missed a night in those revival meetings. And the last night of the meeting, the Lord really had me under conviction, and I accepted Christ. I remember it as though it were today. I went forward. All of us went forward afterward. Stayed up in the front at the first. She sat us all down and told everybody they could leave if they wanted. And she went through the whole plan of salvation. Very, very clearly. Her name was Mrs. Joshua. So I ran all the way home. And I told my mother I'd accepted Christ as my Savior. And I went to my own home church the next Sunday and asked for baptism. Well, in those days, they didn't baptize you immediately. You had to prove you were a Christian. And my mother had to get up on a Sunday morning and testify that she thought I had changed, you know. And so I never went back to the church, but that's where I was saved. And I grew up in this little independent Baptist church in a very small town in western New York State, close to Buffalo. When I was 13, my church young people used to go to a summer camp, or not a camp, when I was 13, I had to go into a tuberculosis preventatorium for 1 year, because when I was 8 years old, I had contact with a person dying of tuberculosis. And the public health made you go for x-rays and shots, and my arm had a real large reaction to the TB vaccine, and they said, well, you have to go for a year to this. I didn't have tuberculosis in my lungs, but they felt it would be good for me. So I went there for 1 year. When I finished that year, they said I could go home, and the family came, and we're going to a Bible conference, Otisega Bible Conference. They picked me up on a Sunday, which was 40 miles from my home. And at the Bible conference I had gone to previously with the young people of my church. But we had a preacher was preaching that day, and his name was Roy Brown. Where are you in the will of the Lord? Gave a powerful, powerful message. And I had been under conviction that year at the Sand that the Lord wanted me to be a missionary. So, I think I was the last one to the altar that day, but there were around 100 young people went forward at that summer conference in Lime Lake, New York. I was 14 years of age. Dedicated my life to full-time Christian service. I went back to my own home, and I had been with the same kids from first grade, and I wanted to accompany my class. But at the sanitarium, they didn't have any high school, and I was in the first year of high school. So I really missed first year of high school. But the teacher of the primary kids helped me with biology and 2 or 3, French. I don't know, she helped me, tutored me a little bit. We had to take state regions in New York State then. If you finished a year of biology, you had to take a state examination. So I went back to my school, high school, and did 4 years of high school practically in 3. And when I was a junior, I went to Boston, Massachusetts, and enrolled in Gordon College of Theology and Missions. It was founded by A.J. Gordon. And it was started as a missionary preparation school. Now it's Gordon Conwell, but
Right.
back then it was just
Right.
Gordon College. And I was there a year, but then I had a breakdown again. I graduated from high school at 17. So I was there a year, and then I had like almost nervous exhaustion. I just pushed myself so much that they advised me to stay out of school a year. Just take just take a year off and come back. So I went to, and by the way, my home church, my little home church, was a great missionary church. When I was a young girl, we had over 20 young people in a church that only had 100 members. 20 of the young people were volunteers for the ministry or missionaries. And some of them went to Christian Missionary Bible College out on the Hudson River.
Nyack College.
Nyack, yeah. And went to Africa with Christian Missionary Alliance. Some of my girlfriend. Anyway, I went to, so I went home, and that summer went back to this Bible conference where I dedicated my life at 14, attended the Bible conference, and while I was there, my pastor came up to me and he said, Dorothy, he said, you're a volunteer for the mission field, and I believe the Lord wants you on the mission field. But he says, I don't think the devil does, because you've got a history of TB. You've got now a kind of a nervous breakdown. It wasn't really a nervous breakdown, it was more mental exhaustion. And he says, missions are very, very hard in their selection. In those days, it took me 5 weeks to get to Brazil on an ocean
On a boat.
And no airline, So he said, I would like to anoint you and pray that the Lord would really touch your body. And I have a suggestion. Would you go out to Brazil for 2 years? If the Lord touches your body, would you go out to Brazil for 2 years and see how you do, learn the language, find out what courses you want to finish, and all of that. Well, our church did not teach healing. I mean, I'd never heard anointing. We didn't have, and he was a independent Baptist pastor. But he says, we'll do it over to, he and his wife were there, an elderly woman, and another lady from Toronto who was teaching in Buffalo. Those 4 met in his room. And he anointed me and prayed. Well, I didn't see any flames or fire, but I had an inner conviction that the Lord had taken me at my word. So I went back. Well, that summer I was helping in the dining room also, and we had to get up real early and go over and set the tables for breakfast, and whatnot. Previously, my hand, this hand, was covered with seed warts, thick seed warts. And his wife, pastor's wife, had tried to get me to go to Buffalo and have those burned off. And I said, no, and she said, oh, well, people don't like to take hold of a handful of warts. I said, it's okay if they don't want to shake my hand, Then next morning when I got up, my hand didn't have a wart on it. And to me, it was an outward symbol of an inward touch, you know. I rushed over to where the pastor and his wife were, rapped on their door, and I said, "Come on out here, I want to show you something." So they came out, and I showed them my hand. So I said, "I believe that this is a sign that the Lord really did touch my body, and that I have made my agreement to go to Brazil for 2 years." And he said, "Well," he said, I want to go back to the sanitarium and find out what the doctors, your records there, and I want to take you to a doctor in Buffalo and have him check you out, and and see everything." He said, "How soon would you be willing to go?" Now that was the 4th of August, 1934. And I said, my husband had graduated from Toronto Bible College and 4 years of university at Wheaton. It took him 2 years to raise his support of $25 a month. That was the missionary support. So I said, "Well, I'm ready. I'll go anytime, soon as possible." So, but I said, "There's one condition, and that I have to go home and talk to my mother, because I wasn't 21. And my mother, my parents separated and were divorced. My mother had raised us, put us through high school and everything, and I said, and she was a devout Christian, and I said, I have to go home and talk to my mother." So I went home that weekend, talked to my mother and explained to her, and she said, "Dorothy," because, we found out that for the Brazilian visa, for me to go to Brazil, I had to be 21. To stay, because I was getting a permanent visa.
Wow.
I mean, for a 2-year period back then. I don't know that they called it permanent then, but I did have a permanent cartela later. So I said, I would have to have your signature. And she said, "Well, Dorothy, I want to pray about it for a week. I want to talk to the officials of the church." And she said, "I'll come over to the conference next week and tell you my reply." So she came the next week, and she says, "Dorothy," she says, "you know, I could say that I wouldn't let you go, but the Lord could take you from me permanently." She said, "If it's the Lord's will for you to go, I'm not going to hinder you." So she signed her papers. I left for Brazil with full support in September,
Oh, wow.
about 6 weeks later. I didn't come home for 7 years, because soon after I arrived in Brazil, I went down to the coast to meet a ship that was coming in with our pastor's son. He was engaged to one of the girls in our church, but she didn't have any Bible school, and she was going to finish school and come out later. So I went down to the pier in Paraíba, do Norte, and saw the ship come in. And the pier, I lived with a couple, Mr. and Mrs. Carl Matthews, that first year, in a little town about 130 miles inland in the state of Paraíba. And I went down to the ship, and Mr. Carl had gone to get immigration and all the officials to see his brother-in-law. Oh, Bob, the pastor's son, was a brother to the couple that I lived with. So they went down to the coast to get Bob and see him. She hadn't seen him for 2-3 years. Got down there, and I went up beside the ship, and I saw one man on the deck, all dressed up, nice blue suit, you know, shine shoes. And I said, "Do you know if there's a Bob Stanley aboard this ship?" And he said, oh yeah, he's my roommate. He said, I'm missionary too. He says, I'm Edward Knechtel. And that's where we met. I was on the land and he was on the ship. Well, he had to go to Recife for a year of language study. But they had rented a cottage on the beach to spend their month of holiday. And they invited Ted to go and spend the holiday since he'd been a roommate with Bob on the trip. And they were both going to Recife to study. So that's where we got acquainted. And then that year, the next month, we moved to the state of Ceará. Now my book is about the state of Ceará. What I've told you is about Paraíba. That's previous to that time. And so we began correspondence, and as a result, 2 years later, we were married. And I had not finished Bible college, so I planned to go home. And when I planned to come home and finish, we wrote to he wanted to be engaged, but he couldn't be engaged without the board's permission, mission board. So the field executive said, well, both of you write letters to the mission, and we'll make a recommendation for you. And here we get a cable, a telegraph. In those days, it took 5 weeks to get a letter, you know. We get a cable from the mission. Wait a minute. Yeah, this is 2 years. Oh, well, I went up to Paraíba, and he went to Recife for his year of language. And I went up to Paraíba, and this couple moved. We had 3 couples go from Paraíba to open the work in Ceará. And at that time, the only work in Ceará that was really established was a Presbyterian work. And that was principally in the city of Fortaleza. They had a fine Brazilian pastor, a very nice church. And our mission, before they went up there, went to him and talked to him about the need of the state. At that time, that state was practically totally unevangelized as far as the gospel was concerned. And he said, I've been praying for years that the mission would send somebody up here to evangelize our state. And he said, I welcome you with open arms. So we went over to we were to go over to the other side of the state. But we didn't go there until after he came up a year later, and we were married in 1936. But when I landed in Paraíba, I did want to tell you this. When I landed in Paraíba, there is tremendous persecution of the gospel. I mean, the month before I landed there in that little town, the priest had organized a meeting to meet behind the Catholic Church and go over and tear down our church. They had established a little congregation, had a little church building. They were to go over and tear the church down. Somebody in town learned about that and sent a telegram to the governor of Paraíba saying that there was going to be a uprising against the Protestants in Esperança, and would he send a troop, force. So telegram, in those times, the telegraph man turned off the telegram about 7 o'clock or 6 o'clock at night. The last thing that came over the telegram that night was a telegram from the governor saying, give all guarantees to the Americans and to the Christians, the believers, crentes, in Esperança. I'm sending troops. So they disbanded. He grabbed the telegram, ran up to the church. They were already gathering. And said, here's the order from the governor, you're not doing anything. So I mean, I arrived there at a very critical time. They had big debates between Reverend Shemanis in Campina Grande with one of the big priests in Recife on the transubstantiation, different subjects that differed, you know, Catholicism and Protestantism. Well, that was in 1935. But in 1938, in Paraíba, a priest led persecution in Catolé da Rocha, which is 150 miles or so inland. And our mission had 5 churches established with a national pastor. These 5 churches were like congregations of one main church. They tore down all 5 churches in one night to the ground. I mean, broke the seats, took down the rafters, everything. And the pastor escaped because he was a Brazilian pastor. He escaped because somebody in town who was a Catholic learned about this happening and went and got him and hid him in their car and took him out of town. But those were really, really, you know, the state of Paraíba at that time, that was the time of Lampião.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh.
Paraíba was famous for its violence, violent men, you know. And different times they had laid roadblocks for the Christian leaders and all of these different times. It was a really, I actually have all of that written up in Portuguese. I have it all that history written by a Brazilian. And that was in 38, but we were already working in the interior of Ceará. Well, I just want to add, you've read my book, you know more or less what's going on. But since we've left the field, my husband had established, after we were in Fortaleza, you read the book, I came down with active tuberculosis of the lungs. I'd been in Brazil 11 years. In the interior, at that time, 8 years we had no vegetables because it was beans and rice, you know. And the people had never eaten vegetables. We might have a squash, girimu we call it. Girimu in the rainy season, you know, and they would cut that up and put it in the beans. But that was the only vegetable. So anyway, I went down to 79 pounds in weight. I weighed 79 pounds. In the meantime, we had worked up in the interior for 8 years in total opening work in places. Today, in one town where we preach the gospel the first time today, the mission has $1 million radio station and a church that holds 700. In the city of Fortaleza now, our church, our mission has already established. I've almost lost count of how many churches. But one of the churches that is pastored by one of the graduates of the SEBIMA, you know, I told you, Seminary and Bible Institute of Fortaleza. My husband founded in 1949 after we went back from my having TB, because the doctors told me that I couldn't go back into the interior again. I'd have to live where I could get a better diet and have x-rays. So we worked, I went back in 1947 and we retired in 74. The Lord really did a miracle. But today we have a church in Fortaleza that seats 1,000, which I myself can hardly comprehend. The last time I saw it, I think they had around 300-400 in the congregation. But the Lord has blessed the gospel in the state of Ceará. And our mission has actually taken out most of our missionaries from the state of Ceará, because most of the nationals today are carrying the work. And the Bible Institute, you'll be interested in this, the Bible Institute this year has founded a mission in connection with the Bible Institute for sending Brazilians to foreign countries as missionaries. And they say that the funds are coming in from the churches. And we're a very depressed area because we are subject to drought. We don't have any natural resources. We don't have coal. We don't have forests. We don't have. It's like New Mexico, mostly cactus and shrub country. The main product when I went to Brazil was carnaúba, the carnaúba wax. And the Johnson Company from Racine, Wisconsin, bought all of the, so much wax a year. But the government controlled how much they could take. They were only allowed to cut so many leaves off the tree a year to get the wax. But today, that's not such a popular thing because of these chemicals that are today, you know. Back then, they didn't have these what do we call them? Synthetics. And but today, Ceará still is one of the world's sources of carnaúba, which does the best in those dry areas, you know. The drier the year, the more wax there is on the tree. So anyway, and then in more recent years, one of the sources, we don't have any big industry like the South. São Paulo has automobile industry, steel industry. In fact, we have a lot of high-rises now in Fortaleza. And I asked a friend of mine who's an engineer, I said, his name it doesn't matter what his name is, but he was a boy that played with my kids when they were little. I said, tell me something, are those buildings that are going up there have steel in them? He said, no. We don't have any steel in 8 and 10 story buildings because he said it'd be too expensive. You know, in the South they have steel. But up in our area, there's no place that would have to import it. I said, well, pray that we don't have an earthquake. Because, you know, brick and mortar will go down if there's an earthquake.
But there has a lot of
Pardon?
storm. There doesn't have any storm and thunderstorm.
Thunderstorm?
Thunderstorm and storm doesn't have it there.
I'm gonna see if I hear better without my hearing aid today.
I ask you if there has a lot of thunderstorm or storm.
Oh, no,
No,
we don't
none of
have
that
hurricanes. We
No.
don't have hurricanes. As a matter of fact, I said I'd rather fly in Brazil than here in America. Because maybe down south you have big storms, but
There
we
have,
don't.
yes.
We wish we had some rain.
Yeah.
But we don't have hurricanes, we don't have earthquakes, we don't have any of these terrible
Yes,
things
it's
that
true.
we're having
Yes,
here in
that's
America.
why the build doesn't have any iron. And that's why the build doesn't have any iron, any steel.
Uh-huh.
Because doesn't
Yeah,
have
but
any
yeah, that's true. But you know, earthquakes, there's one of the largest things right off the coast of Ceará.
The Ecuador.
Goes between Africa and Brazil. There's a fault.
Fault line.
They call it a fault. So they could have an earthquake.
The largest
And
fault.
Fortaleza is built on a sand dune. I mean, it's up on a sand dune. But it's a very pretty city. Fortaleza. Today they now have, I understand, 3 million people. Gotten big. Who's calling? Quem fala?
Linda está lá.
Oh. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of background, on what's what.
Como é que
But my ministry in Brazil, my husband, when we married, I told my husband, I said, I was called to be a missionary when I was 14. My whole life has been geared toward that. I said, if you just want a wife, I said, I'm not the one. I said, because he says I prayed for a fellow worker.
Amen.
And so as a family, we had 2 horses. We traveled, 5 of us on 2 horses for 8 years. There were no trucks, no cars.
How old is your horse?
Pardon?
Quantos anos tinha o seu cavalo?
Cavalos?
Quantos anos?
A
Era
idade,
novo?
a idade do cavalo.
The idade do cavalo?
Yeah.
Sim,
Brand new?
was brand new. The horses was brand new or
The horses were estradeiros. They were taught. The horses in our state are not used for show.
Uh-huh.
They're used for
Work.
wear.
Yeah.
And you can travel 35 miles a day on a horse in our state. They're small. They're not big. Mine was a pedrez. That's kind of a gray, dappled. My husband's was a white.
How many mileage?
I've traveled 15 or 20 miles in a day with the children, I had 2 children on my horse, and my husband had 1 because his horse was crazy. And he was not a real good horseman. He grew up in Toronto, Canada.
I know.
He'd never ridden a horse. I rode horses before I went to Brazil. So, but one day a week, my husband, after we went inland and began our work, no one in town would allow us to come near. I mean, they wouldn't have us in their houses. They would cross themselves when they went in front of our house.
Yeah.
Because we were supposed to really be the devil,
Yeah.
I
I still remember those days.
Yeah.
They threw stone on us, the pedra.
Yeah, they did there at us too. We in fact, one time they would throw. My husband rented a hall, and he made the pulpit and he made the seats and everything. And we would have. I would sing. He would play a piano accordion. He would preach, and we'd be the only ones there.
Amen.
But people would come to the window, and then I would get up and give tracts out. After the meeting, it looked like snow. They were all torn up,
Yeah.
But there were people saved even through some of
I
those
know.
scriptures. And the first convert, we really, and he is the great-grandfather of many of our workers today in the state, was in his 50s when he accepted the Lord. But the accordion broke because we had to have carriers put the accordion on their head and carry it. Before we had the horses, my husband would go up, and then if he would see somebody beside of a house, and he'd ask them if he could have a meeting, that he had music downtown. Well, he'd send down and get somebody to go down and get the accordion. They'd go up into the mountains because we were at the foot of a mountain range which separated our state from the next state. And when he'd get up there, so the accordion was broken. We don't know if it was dropped or what, but he didn't know how to fix it. So one night we heard an accordion being played in the street. We couldn't believe it because nobody had accordion. So the next day my husband went out to the market and he says, who was playing the accordion in the street last night? And they said, there's a fellow from Fortaleza. He's a son of Ipu. We lived in Ipu. And he says, the son of Ipu, and he came up here and he was playing the accordion for somebody that wanted him to play to his sweetheart, So my husband looked him up and he said, do you know anybody could fix an accordion? And he said, no, I don't really, but he says there is a man here that fixes anything. He says he'll
That's
fix,
Brazil.
To Brazil.
he'd do anything. I mean, an old
This is what happened.
sewing machine, probably 100 years old. But he'd get it to working again, and he would build the mills for farinha.
Mhm.
Pilão.
You had to have the
Nepilão,
things to press the press, and he'd do all of that. He says, so he told my husband, he says, his name is San Antonio, and told him where he lived. My husband went up there and asked him if he could fix the accordion. He says, I don't know if I can or not, but if you leave it here, he says, I'll see what I can do. So Ted gave him a tract, and the tract said, "O caminho de sair das trevas," a way to go out of darkness. And Ted went off to the mountains. In those days, we didn't have a horse, and he would go by foot up the mountain. The mountain people were more receptive to him than townspeople. So he went up the mountain, he wasn't there, and somebody clapped at the door. And we didn't knock. We never knocked on the door, It was always clapping, oh, de casa.
To be far from the house, right?
Yeah,
To
yeah.
be stank.
Yeah, whoever's in the house, come to the door. And I went to the door, and this man said, I've come here, he says, would you be the wife of the man who brought his accordion to my house? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, he says, I read that paper he gave me. And he said, it's what I need. He said, do you have that book that it talks about, the Bible? And he says, I've heard that it's a forbidden book. The padre doesn't want anyone to have that book. But he says, do you have one? And I said, yes, we do. And he said, how much is it? He had 16 children.
Wow.
He said, well, I just fix stuff. And he says, I don't have a lot of money, but I'll tell you, if you'll let me have that book, I'll service the accordion.
Amen.
You know how the things that look like they're a tragedy, and the Lord uses them for good.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
the Bible.
That whole family practically accepted the gospel during the years. He has a grandson in the ministry today. Of course, he's dead. He's gone. But he
He
gave
had
good-
the church already. 16
Good.
children is a
Yeah.
big church.
Yeah.
A good start.
Yeah. So he was the beginning, and then he invited my husband, to go out to out places where he had received. We found another thing in Brazil. It's very interesting. As they say, it's better to have money friends in the park than money in the box. If you have a friend in Brazil, it opens doors.
Everything.
When we were married, we went up to a little town in the interior of Ceará that was in the mountains, and it was cooler. They told us it was a nice place to go, but no one would have anything to do with us, For one thing, we were foreigners, and secondly, we were Protestants. Two bad things. And they didn't have anything to do with us. Years later, maybe 20 or 30 years later, we had a Brazilian doctor in Fortaleza who was our friend. He was married to an American. And he said to us one day, he said, I'd like you to go up to Guaramiranga with me. He says, I have a patient up there who has a situ. It's like a farm,
Little farm.
fruit farm or something. He said, they've invited us to go up. He said, you have a station wagon, we could all go. I think it's around 60 miles from Fortaleza or so. It isn't the Serra Grande, it's just a mountain that comes out of the Sertão. And so we agreed to go. Well, we got up there, and this family, they put everything out. We had a picnic. they had a traditional, they put on a traditional thing for us that we'd never seen before, horsemen, and they had the ribbon of their girlfriend on their dart, and this is historic, comes back from Portugal, you know, this custom. I don't think they do it anymore, but anyway, they had that for us. They put and I said, we were accepted, and it reminded me of the scripture, we're accepted in the beloved. You know, in Christ, God accepts us in His Son. And we were accepted not because we were Americans or Protestants, but because He was a friend of theirs. We were accepted through Him.
Through his friend, yeah.
Wow.
Em Brasil, nós dizemos, se é meu amigo, é amigo dos meus amigos, né? Então você tá, é relação todo
Yeah.
mundo.
Well, here, you know, we have a saying, love me, love my dog. If you don't love somebody's
Yeah.
dog, you're in trouble.
You in trouble. Sister, can you diz, como que a senhora teve essa... Por que o Brasil? Why is Brazil?
Why what, Brazil?
Yeah, why you choose Brazil to go missionary?
Well, the missionaries had come to our church,
From Brazil?
and yeah, from Brazil. This couple that I lived a year with, Carlos Mateos, they were missionaries under this mission. And our mission traces, I went out under the Evangelical Union of South America, and I went with their permission. And that mission traces itself to the 1800s, when Dr. Robert Calley from Scotland had to flee from that island off from Africa because of persecution. And he was invited to go to Brazil because of those Americans who in the Civil War left the United States and went to Brazil. You know, they went to, did you ever hear about that? Yeah, you know, after the Civil War and slavery, you weren't supposed to have slaves.
Yeah.
A lot of people from the South went to
Yeah.
Brazil.
No, I never know. Oh,
Yeah.
yes, I read about it.
Yeah,
Yes.
Yeah, they
that's
went to Brazil.
So the
he
Brazil
was,
at that time
he was
was the
invited
field.
by these
Mission field.
people to go to Brazil, and he settled in Rio de Janeiro, well, Petrópolis, just out of Rio de Janeiro.
Yeah.
I have visited there, and there's a plaque on a wall
I have
telling
been there.
that it's the first Protestant
Yeah.
in Portuguese in Brazil.
Yeah.
Protestant Sunday school.
Yeah, the thing.
That was Dr. Robert Calley, and he was a friend of Don Pedro II. And
That's old.
one time he was sick. He was supposed to go see Don Pedro, and Don Pedro, and he couldn't because he was sick. So somebody said, well, Dr. Robert Calley didn't come because he was a doctor, you know. He says he couldn't come because he was sick. So Don Pedro had gotten better, and he went to visit Dr. Robert Calley.
Dom Pedro II.
Yeah,
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
yeah.
So, yeah.
And I have all of that down, written by a Brazil, written in Portuguese. History of all of that.
Wow, that's great.
But they founded what is called the Igrejas Cristãs Evangélicas, a Cristã Congregacional do Brasil. It has two divisions. The Christian churches, baptized by immersion. The Congregationalists, baptized by aspersion.
Yeah.
But they don't, any of them, baptize children. They only baptize from 15 years and
Yes.
up.
Mm-hmm.
They have to be old enough to know what they're doing
Understanding. Yeah.
before they were,
Make decisions.
yeah. But our churches were called Iglesias Evangelicas.
Tell them about what you used to do, the flannel graph painting and all the ministry.
Pardon?
Tell them about what you did on the mission field, you personally, the teaching, the
Well,
flannel
they
graph
saw that
teaching.
in the book, I guess. I went with my husband on all of our trips. Once we had, well, after we'd been there about, let's see, we went in there when we were married in 1936, had our first converts. But most of the people who accepted the gospel were up in the mountains, up in the hills. And I already had my first baby in 1937. So we didn't have transportation, and my husband would go by foot. So he said, we're going to pray for horses. We're going to need horses. So our churches in America sent us money for horses and saddles. And we got horses, and we traveled together. And they built us a little place in the mountain that, well, we called it the church house, because the big saloon in the front is where we would have our meetings. And then we had a little very primitive kitchen and another little room where we could hang hammocks. We slept in hammocks. So my husband would go up and spend 1 or 2 nights a week up in the mountains. Our few converts in a pool we had on Sunday, and he had a weekly meeting with them also. But finally he said, well, you know what? All of the converts are men. The women were devout Catholics. I mean, they'd lock the doors, they'd lock the windows. They wouldn't allow a meeting inside their houses, but they'd have them out in the quintal, you know, outside on the yard. So Ted says, you know what? He says, we're going to have to get horses and you go up there, because he says the women just won't come to a men's meeting. And that's when I began going with the baby, and our children always accompanied us. And we had, my husband made, even for the last baby, Nathan, who you know, Nathan, my big fat son. He was a baby, and my husband made out of canvas. He made a hanging crib, and it had sticks in it like you would put in a camp cot, you know. But it would fold up and go into a suitcase, and you could hang it on a hammock hook. Hang it on a hammock hook. Yeah. And then what happened when I had 2 children and 3 children, I would get a word that somebody was sick up in the, well, I began going once a week by myself with a Brazilian girl her age, 12 years old. She would ride on the rump of the horse and go with me. And I was the first woman in that area to ride astride. Everybody rode side saddle. The women rode side saddle. But you can't ride side saddle and go alone. You have to have somebody help you up into
That's crazy.
up into your seat. So I had a divided or like a skirt. I didn't wear pants. They didn't wear pants.
Yeah.
But I wore
Culotte.
culottes. And it was, when you stood up, it was like a skirt.
Yes.
And so that girl would go with me, and we would spend the night in the homes up there. And I've delivered babies. I've buried babies. I've had funeral services. I didn't preach. I taught. I taught children and I taught women, but I didn't get up in the pulpit to preach. And then later we had Brazilian graduate of Bethel Bible Institute in Paraíba. We had a girls' school in Paraíba do Norte. And we had several of those girls. In my book I tell their names, yeah, that worked with us up in Sierra, did wonderful work. But then when I went back, after I had TB, and we weren't allowed to go back into more primitive work, I began teaching in the Bible Institute that my husband taught. I taught child evangelism and Sunday school method. And he started with 5 men in 1949. And today we have around 100 in this year. There are around 100. I just got a report in the seminary. But these went, and then in 1952 we had a furlough here in Chattanooga, and I went to Tennessee Temple College, a university here in Chattanooga, and took flannel graph painting because the women could not afford to buy child evangelism scenes. You know, they're quite expensive. And back there we used the figures a lot to tell the stories. So I took a year of flannel graph painting and did all of the scenes for anything in the Bible, really. And I taught 2 hours on Saturdays and 2 hours on Tuesday night, Brazilian women, to do flannel graph painting. I mean, they painted their own scenes. And in the beginning, we had to even paint those figures that we used. Now everything is beautiful, you know, colored. Well, I did that. Then I worked, of course, in our local national churches, which had pastors by then in the 50s, and was active in the women's work, children's work. I founded a Christian day school in one of our congregations, and one of the boys who came from the interior, and I only had the first 5 grades, primario, curso primario, and had Brazilian teachers. Well, this boy came with his family from Itapipoca, which was in the inland, down there, and he was about the 5th grade when he came to my school. But he was a brain. I mean, the kid, you could just tell that he was going to be something. And he finished 5th grade, and I had friends, neighbors, who founded the 7th of September College in Fortaleza. Today they have thousands. They have 3 campuses and a university campus from this same man that founded, and he was a Christian, outstanding Christian in Fortaleza. So I phoned him and I said, Dr. Dielson, I said, would you consider accepting a boy from our school? I said, he is very, very smart, but his father's, at that time his father was up in the 80s, I think, and they don't have the money to pay tuition. So would you be able to take him? I said, I'll arrange for him to do something around home or something, help with the tuition. And he said, well, he'll have to sit for the examination, you know, take the entrance exam.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, that's fine. So he took the entrance exam and he accepted him and he went. And I don't know how many months later, Dr. Dilson phoned me. And he said, Donna Dorothy, don't worry about that boy. He says, we'll see that he goes through.
Wow.
He is an outstanding mind. He today is a professor of mathematics in the University of Sierra, and he's written papers in mathematics that have been published in America.
Wow.
Yeah, and his name is in my book. He helped organize the book in Portuguese, and I wasn't able to go to the lanzamiento, or when my book was put out, and it was put at the graduation exercises last year, and he spoke in my behalf.
Oh, great.
But it's amazing. Some of those young kids, you know, this church was out in, close to the ocean. It was out in the dunas. And the children, there were no children could go to school, not even primary school at that time. There was none close by. But today, practically and some of them work in a bank today. It's amazing how far they've gone in education.
Tell them about the radio station. You were telling me it.
What's that?
Tell them about the radio station. You were telling me that they.
Well,
now
the radio station I really didn't have anything to do with, but we did go to that town back when my daughter was a baby. And we would stay a week. For a year, we rented a house in this little town. And would go there for a week, and we'd have meetings every night in front of the house, hang a lantern outside of the house, and have a street meeting. But we didn't see any results. We didn't have any converts. So after a year, other places were opening up, and we had to decide what we're going to do with our time, and we dropped it. Later, the mission sent missionaries there, and today, as I say, they have I don't know how many congregations in that place. They have $1 million radio program that reaches most of Sierra. It isn't international, but it has two different, what do we call it, AM and FM or something like that. And it's partially supported by the nationals now. Another thing that I did, I can't remember what furlough I was on. I guess it was the same year that I took the flannelgraph, because we did speaking in all of these churches, and Tennessee Temple. We represented our mission at their annual mission conference during one of our furloughs, and I saw two missions that had Bible memorization for children. One was Children's Bible Mission, and another was the Bible Memorization Organization. I forget the legal name of that, but I talked to them about opening a Bible memorization work in Sierra. And Children's Bible Mission made it easier for me. The other one wanted everything had to be sent from America. All of the books, the awards, they gave awards at certain stages. All of those had to come from America. Well, back then we had a problem with the alfándega, with the customs. They charge on stuff. But our mission already had founded a Bible bookstore in the city. And so Children's Bible Mission told me I could use their system, but we could use the books that were available at our Bible bookstore. So I introduced that children memorized 300 Bible verses, depending on how old they were, how many verses they had to recite at a time. And I appointed a person in each church to hear these verses. And I had printed a book with all the Bible verses for each group, you know, so that the person who listened wouldn't have to open the Bible every time a child was reciting. You can't memorize. And so that developed. I had children come 700 miles later and once a year the final award was a week at Bible conference out at our campgrounds. And I had 100 children at a time out there. I'd rent a city bus, take them on a tour of the city, and these kids from the Sertang had never seen a big city.
Yes.
They'd never seen the Atlantic Ocean, and we were a coastal city. So it was really cute. One day, one of the boys from the driest area of our state, and we came down over the hill, over the dune, looking out over the ocean, and he said, "Oh, that cost the federal government a lot of money to build that Asubi." The Atlantic Ocean.
Really?
He knew that the government built reservoirs, you know. But that was gonna cost the government an awful lot of money to build the Atlantic Ocean.
The whole country's money to do this.
See? Oh, we had to laugh. And then we'd take them to down where the ships came in. And they sang
Oh, yeah, I remember that. They
in
took
parks.
the kids and go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one of our missionaries who died a year or two ago down here in Georgia, she would come down all the time and take care of the music for my camp. And she would teach them part singing. And, you know, they'd sing in parts, and we'd sing in front of the ships. One time, one Brazilian ship invited the children to all go aboard the ship and showed them everything and explained things to them. But this one year, we took them down. We took them to see the governor. We presented the governor with a Bible, and they all signed their names and the town or the county that they were from, you know. And oh, those were wonderful times. We had wonderful camps. We'd have spell downs, you know, and we had Moody film for them in the evening, these science films, beautiful films from Moody Bible Institute. We'd have those in Portuguese, and these kids from the Sertão, they really, I mean, they didn't know anything but beans and rice. And to have 3 meals a day and merenda in between, they'd say, "Can we learn 300 more verses to come back?" But it was for children up to 16, through 16. They could come as long as they were 16. They came down on the trains. They came. One of the pastors brought his children. He had a group from his church that would come every year, memorize. And his daughter, I think, was one of the winners one year. And amazing how they could memorize those scriptures and quote them. They had to give the verse, the scripture, and the verse
Yeah, everything.
reference. And I hear from them, you know, I get letters from them. Talking about when they went to camp. So,
I bet they miss you.
so we loved, I mean, every day I was in Brazil, I just loved it. Yeah. We came home because of our children. Back then, we couldn't educate them out there. I tried to educate Nathan. Baptist, the Southern Baptist, Brazilian Baptist, but they had some Southern Baptist missionaries that opened a school for Brazilian children in Portuguese. And tuition was fairly expensive. But anyway, we decided I had taught the others by correspondence course. And I thought, well, I'll send them up to him to the Brazilian school. So he took 1st and 2nd grade in the Colégio Batista. And we came on a furlough, which he would have entered the 3rd grade there. But because of his age, they didn't start as young in the Primeiro Ano back then. And he would only go into the 3rd grade in Brazil, but he got here to Chattanooga, and they put him in the 4th grade. And he carried the work beautifully, did fine. So when we went back at the end of furlough, he would go into the 5th grade here. And they wouldn't let him even go into the 3rd grade there. They said he had to go back to the 3rd grade because they wouldn't give him any credit for what he did in America.
Yeah,
And
today it's.
And he
it's
said,
not this way.
no, he says, send for the correspondence course. He says, I'm not going to be 2 grades behind my friends.
Yes.
you know, children are very sensitive.
But our age is from Brazil to here is more strong.
What?
From Brazil to here, the school in Brazil is more strong. When you come from third, you can be in the fourth here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Now, still.
yeah.
Yeah,
But
if
see,
you move here
their
to that-
first grade, I think then was about 7 years of age.
yeah,
Yeah,
it is. The year that you make 7.
yeah, but by then you're in the second grade here. You start when you're 5. I started school when I was 5 and graduated from high school when I was 17.
It's different.
So, I mean, I had a full ministry all the years I was there.
Still in
And for
ministry.
18 years, I had the mission home. In connection with all teaching my children, I had a mission home with 18, 20 people in the house most of the time.
Because this you miss the people around when you came here.
Yeah, and the only room we had that was our own bedroom. I mean, for 18 years, we just lived in the middle of people, but I like people. So,
We know. We can feel that. It's, I don't know if everybody knows the Brazil history about the church in Brazil, the Protestant church in Brazil, but Brazil have the same age like the United States, around 1,500.
uh-huh.
It's the same age when, you know, you guys know about Américo Vespucci, the name from America. So, but in Brazil, the Catholic people, it's really have, they have totally, how can I call this? They just Catholic people there, nobody. Until they beginning and to be there, the Protestant people around 1800.
But you know, the Brazilians do great in America. I mean, in school.
Yeah, and but when the missionaries started to go to Brazil, it's like she said that about the first one, Robert Kelly was from Scotland, but I studied the history, the Protestant history in Brazil. Most of the missionary is from America, United States. So we all,
Yeah.
Lindolfo, Lucia, and I, we are a result of Americans, missionaries,
Yeah.
that one day put everything out and listen Acts 1:8 that they say, but you receive the power, how you can call this? Act 1:8. You will receive the power
When the Holy Spirit, and then you will go. and
the
be
Spirit,
my
yeah,
disciples.
and go. I think you Americans, you guys Americans, heard the word and say go to Samaria, Jerusalem, Samaria until the long
Until
end.
Jesus
And,
comes.
And you, yeah, and you went
End of
too
door.
far away, yeah.
Yeah,
And of
yeah.
course.
So yes,
Well, I believe that anybody can be a missionary right here in America.
oh yes,
And I think it's wonderful that there are as many Brazilians here in America preaching. Mr. Camargo, who is a Brazilian here, and I would have liked to had him here today, but I really didn't know you all were coming until I went to Atlanta. I knew you were coming sometime, but I didn't know you were coming today. And it being